Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar on the oh-so-pleasant topic of mold. My name is James and I'll be your moderator for the event. Before we get started, I'd like to give you a brief overview on what the webinar is going to entail, some housekeeping items, and some information on the different components of this event. We will kick things off with a slideshow presentation addressing the various types of mold and their health effects, how to identify mold, and we'll finish off with a case study illustrating a real-world mold incident. Following the presentation, there will be an open Q&A period. You can ask questions anytime during the webinar by typing them into the questions pane on the right-hand side of your screen. Everyone's microphones will be turned off during the webinar, so you cannot voice any questions, but again, you can use that questions box to communicate. Please keep in mind you will receive a copy of the slide deck and the webinar recording tomorrow. So all of the materials that are presented today by our speaker, you will receive very shortly. Today's speaker, Patrick Doyle, is a research assistant at Boston College, where he is currently investigating the effects of dietary restriction and privately developed drugs on mice with implanted cancerous tumors. He's also a contributor to Triumvirate Environmental, where he has created content based on his field experience, including the decommissioning of chemistry and biology labs. And with that, I'll turn things over to Pat. Hey, Pat.
Thank you very much, James. Good morning, everybody. To kick things off, we've got our key message here. Sort of the underlying message that we're trying to get across here is that mold is an issue that's hard to pin down, but understanding and finding it is essential to remediation. You know, there's a lot of gray area that's associated with mold, and that means that most solutions are based on subjective analysis rather than objective data. You can crunch numbers all day long and still not have a better idea of how to combat a potential mold issue in your building. It takes a trained eye with years of experience to fully remediate a mold contamination issue. So who's this for? This webinar is primarily for, this is not an inclusive list, but facilities managers, people who want to manage their liability in their building. It can be a big issue if somebody in your building gets sick due to mold. It can come back to you as potentially endangering the people who are in your building. Also building owners, you want to protect your people living, working in your building, and also your assets. So mold can have a profound structural effect on your building if it is allowed to continue uncontrolled for an extended period of time. Also, if there are any concerned workers that are listening today, we want to enable you guys to act in response to a potential mold issue that you might be experiencing in your building. So what will you learn? The four major things that we're going to go over today are the common types of mold, where to seek out mold in your building, what the presence of mold means for you, and that's a big one. That's one of the things that I'm going to stress today as being particularly important, one of the biggest takeaways of this presentation. And then also how to begin pre-remediation, so how to get the ball rolling on a good, sound strategy to remediate the mold issue that's in your building, make sure that your building is safe for anybody to occupy. Whoever needs to occupy the building can be in there without worrying about the threat of mold. So perspective is crucial when it comes to mold. Here are some major bullet points on mold that you need to keep in mind whenever you're dealing with mold-related topics. First and foremost, mold is everywhere, and it's nearly impossible to completely eliminate. A total mold concentration of 0 simply doesn't happen, but instead, indoor values are compared to a background value typically taken outside the building. Those are going to be what you use to determine the relative levels of mold and therefore what your mode of action should be. You don't need to completely get rid of mold in order to have a safe working environment. Most people with uncompromised immune systems are unaffected by relatively small concentrations of mold spores. And like I said, they're ubiquitous indoors and outside. You're not going to get rid of 100% of the mold, and you don't necessarily have to. That said, there are no federal regulations such as PELs or TLVs for types of mold or mold in general. So unlike other air quality issues like exhaust emissions, that kind of stuff, the effects of chemicals are better understood than the effects of mold spores on your health in the air. However, there are some guidelines that we use when evaluating mold issues. Indoor spore counts of 1,000 or greater are considered elevated, and those would warrant future investigation and remediation. However, spore counts of 1,000 are fairly common outdoors. So outside, it's not that big an issue if you have elevated spore counts, which we typically observe when we're performing air sampling. But if a spore count of around that much, around 4 digits, is present inside, then there might be something there that requires remediation. And lastly, if you give mold a place to grow, it will certainly grow. Mold will grow anywhere that you give it a good medium for growth. You know, Triumvirate gets a lot of calls about people who have set up commercial mold test kits in their building and they've grown mold and suddenly they think it's a big issue. They think that, you know, oh my God, there's mold in my building. What am I going to do? Is it harming me? That kind of stuff. But the truth is that if you give mold an optimum medium like is present in those test kits, it will grow because mold is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. You know, the presence of mold on one of these kits doesn't necessarily mean that you have uncontrolled mold growth or you're in danger. It just means that there are some spores present, as should be, as is normal, as is typically expected. So today's agenda, we're going to run down the common types of mold first, so we're going to get a good understanding of what the typical types of mold that we see in buildings in professional settings are. Then we want to show you how to find if there is mold in your building, where to look, how to look, that kind of information. And then we're going to go over how to formulate a potential mold danger level. So like I said, a little bit of mold in your building is perfectly normal. It's not going to be a huge health risk to the majority of people who are going through your building typically. So we're going to figure out how to formulate a mold danger level for your specific building. And then finally, we're going to have a little case study towards the end. So mold is a two-edged sword. You have hyphae, and these account for visible mold growth. That's what shows. That's what's the little green spot on your wall. That's the black or green, you know, streaking in tile, that kind of stuff. It's rarely harmful, only if ingested. So just as long as you're not going right up to a big fuzzy ball of mold and taking a big whiff, you should be okay. Hyphae isn't going to hurt you directly. However, these hyphae are what causes spores to be released into the air. The spores then are responsible for illness. These are what's getting into your lungs, into your nose, into your mouth, and causing potential health risk. They're ubiquitous in the air, they're everywhere, and they're also easily measured by standard air monitoring. So unlike hyphae, which is more of a qualitative analysis, you know, you see something on the wall that might indicate, you know, discoloration, could be a result of hyphae. Spores, on the other hand, we can go in, perform air monitoring, and then get a concrete number as to the number of spores per cubic meter that is present in your building, and then we can evaluate that for the potential for uncontrolled mold growth. Here we have a characterization table. It's pretty in-depth as to the 4 major types of mold. This is available on the Triumvirate blog. We're just going to take a quick rundown of it really quickly. Common host media, as you can see over on the left, you see the word damp a lot. Mold is going to take place where there's excess moisture, a conducive environment to mold development. Health effects of these types of mold can vary. They can start with, you know, fungal infections similar to athlete's foot, all the way up to something like meningitis, serious infections, that kind of stuff. So there's a broad range of pathogens and conditions that can be caused by any one of these types of mold. However, it's pretty much impossible to correlate a non-specific symptom like a runny nose, cough, that kind of thing directly to a mold problem. That would take a more comprehensive medical examination. But these types of symptoms, like cold-like symptoms, you know, if they're persistent, if they're not going away, if a lot of people develop these symptoms at once, that could point to a potential mold problem that might be worth investigating. Also, it's important to note the prevalence of these spores in the background. So that will give you a better idea of how to kind of look at the mold landscape in a way, the spore landscape inside your building. So for example, Ascospores are very common outdoors. That's typically the biggest number that we see when we're looking at the analytical data from an air sampling event. So if there's a high concentration of Ascospores outside your building and a high concentration within your building, similarly high, there's not going to be that big of a threat from Basidiospores within your building. It's not likely that there are Basidiospores that are forming in your building and being released inside your building. Whereas on the other hand, if you have a high concentration of Basidiospores and a low concentration of Ascospores, for example, outside your building, and then you take data from inside your building, that's going to, if there's a high concentration of Ascospores in your building that's not present outside, that could be a sign that, hey, there might be Ascospores that are being produced and released inside your building. That's going to be cause for concern. So Basidiospores, there's a huge variety of this type of mold. They're very common, and they don't cause visible mold growth. These are typically formed in wet decaying wood, but they still can affect sensitive individuals. So this is one of the types of mold that's hard to see, almost impossible to see with the naked eye, but it can still affect people that have a particular sensitivity to mold: immunocompromised people, children, the sick, the elderly, etc. Cladosporium, these are commonly found in plant matter and compost. So any kind of place where there might be decaying plant matter, even wood, animal bedding, something along those lines is a prime habitat for Cladosporium. So you're going to want to keep an eye out if you work with a terrarium or have a compost pile. At the lab that I work in at Boston College, we keep a lot of animals on the premises that we perform experiments on, and their bedding has the potential to collect a lot of moisture, especially from a water bottle that might be dripping. So during one of our recent experiments, we noticed this. I was able to recognize it, that, hey, there could be the potential for Cladosporium to develop within this bedding that's just soaked with moisture. So this fairly simple solution that we came up with was just to put a dish underneath the bottles of water so that it would not, there wouldn't be persistent moisture within the animal cages that could potentially skew our results, put the animals in danger, put us in danger, etc. Ascospores, these guys are most prevalent during humid periods. So if there's a particularly humid season where you work or where you live, I know in some parts of Arizona there's like a monsoon type season, and around here in the springtime when there's a lot of rain, that's a high potential for Ascospores to be released in huge quantities. As you can see on the right, Ascospores are produced in pods of 8, which means that there's a huge multiplying effect that can take place if you give Ascospores an ideal medium to take root, produce these asci, and then, release spores into the air. Ascospores also includes dermatophytes. So if you look at the etymology of the word dermatophyte, it literally means skin eaters. So definitely going to be bad news. These attack skin and keratin-based structures like hair and nails, and they can produce a variety of skin, hair infections, that kind of stuff. So definitely want to keep an eye out if you think that Ascospores might be present in your building for signs like skin infections, etc. Next we have Penicillium and Aspergillus. These two are closely related, and Penicillium is actually where penicillin, the popular antibiotic, is derived from. Stemming off of Penicillium, we have P. marinifi, and that has been studied to cause invasive infections even in non-immunocompromised individuals. So these infections are rare, but they're very dangerous if they're able to take root. If there's a situation where this type of pathogen is able to take root and be persistent, even if there are non-immunocompromised individuals, people with perfectly healthy functioning immune systems can still experience infection from this type of pathogen. Down the bottom you have aspergillosis. This is a very serious illness caused by Aspergillus mold. It can cause scarring in the lungs, but also this type of mold can cause a formation of an actual ball of fungus in the lungs. So this type of mold spore can get into your lungs, take root there, and cause a wide variety of health issues. And then up in the top right, we have Aspergillus fumigatus. This is another type of mold that stems from Aspergillus, and this was partially found responsible for the NECC meningitis outbreak that happened a couple of years ago. I think it was 2012. And what happened there was mold in the clean room where these drugs were being produced and then they were administered to immunocompromised individuals, and these infected drugs were eventually found to be the cause of a wide variety of infections, including meningitis. So it was there was a lot of liability involved in that case. You know, a few people went to jail. There was, I think, 64 deaths as a result of that case. So definitely a big issue if you run an environment that absolutely has to be sterile. Also involved in that incident were Ascospores and Cladosporium, which were previously mentioned. So we're going to move along. So the habitats, life cycles, and health effects of various molds are very nuanced. That's the one thing that separates all these types of mold is the habitats and life cycles. However, the one major thing that all these types of mold has in common is their preference for damp substrates of various types. So for the purposes of this webinar, for the purposes of future mold remediation, we're going to hone in on this aspect of all molds, the fact that they prefer persistent moisture as a place to take root and then cause all kinds of health effects. And we're going to use that kind of chink in the armor to put together a strategy for preventing mold-related illnesses. Now we're going to shift gears a little bit and go into the potential sources of mold. So this is going to be where you want to look in your building, you know, use a method to pinpoint places where there's a high probability that mold is there and potentially causing health issues. So there are two types of signs of mold contamination. There are primary signs, you know, sight, sound, smell, touch, taste. And you're going to want to use all 5 of these senses to assess your indoor air quality. So your very own, you know, tools can be very useful in determining whether or not you may have a mold issue. Sight, if there are visible signs of mold, that's a dead giveaway that you have an issue. Like you see on the right, there's a lot of black material around this HVAC vent. That is definitely going to be cause for concern. That is going to tell you that, hey, maybe there's mold that's flowing through our air system, going to other parts of the building. That's going to be something that you're going to want to take a look at. Sound as well. If you hear any kind of dripping, you know, that could be resultant from a plumbing leak, which can obviously cause persistent moisture and can be problematic for a potential mold habitat. Also, bad airflow is a sign of mold contamination, not a sign of it can cause mold contamination. Smell might be the #1 indicator that people think that they have a mold problem. We at Triumvirate, we get a lot of calls about people who smell something musty, something moldy, and that is cause enough for them to think, you know, there might be something here. Touch as well, you know, any wet spots, especially in carpet. Carpeting is a big, you know, it's a place where if moisture gets in there, it can be very hard to get out and can be a prime growth medium for mold. High humidity as well. Like I said, the second type of mold that we dealt with, Ascospores, third type, excuse me. You know, those spores are discharged during humid periods, so you're going to want to have an extra eye out during humid periods for different types of mold. Even taste as well, you know, if you develop kind of a sick, phlegmy type of taste in your mouth, feeling in your throat, that could potentially point towards a mold issue, though that in and of itself might not quite be enough to fully substantiate, you know, a mold contamination concern. And secondary signs as well, you know, persistent employee illness. You know, if there's something that, you know, this cough has really been bothering you for several weeks, maybe a month or more, or, you know, something like that, sniffle, that can be cause for concern, especially if it's not something that, you know, might go through the office in a week or two. You know, if it's definitely not caused by a cold, common cold bacterial infection, that could be a sign that you might have a hidden mold problem. So where to look? The major places that we typically find mold are in the plumbing system. That's far and away #1. Where mold can take root, you know, if there's some kind of leak, but also if there's condensation in the plumbing or in your HVAC system. You know, you want to make sure that these condensation drip pans are dried accordingly, consistently, to make sure that there isn't persistent moisture that is, you know, being caused by your plumbing or HVAC system. You want to include your exhaust vents in that search as well. We saw a few slides ago, there was a picture of that HVAC vent that had a lot of black material around it. That's a dead giveaway that there's going to be some mold present in your building, that your HVAC system might even be shooting into different parts of your building, so that can kind of work against you if you suddenly discover mold in an area that has ventilation connections to the rest of your building. Fans as well, same thing. They could be pushing spores around into places that they might not normally go, but places that they might have an optimal medium to grow. And then within your building envelope itself, so one big problem, that a lot of residences have is ice dams. They're an immediate cause for moisture in between the walls of your house or of your building, and that is a very tricky place to dry out, so therefore it can be a tough place for mold remediation to take place, but that could be a potential huge issue both from a health standpoint and from a structural standpoint. So we're going to have a quick poll question. So how concerned are you after learning all this that you might have a mold problem? So we're going to take a few minutes for everybody to respond to that.
Yeah, Pat, so we just launched that poll. We'll give everyone about 20 seconds to respond and share the results with everybody.
Okay, great.
All right, so it looks like 60%, 62% of attendees are somewhat concerned with this mold issue. Another 16 are very concerned. And 20% or so maybe not quite as concerned. So those are the results of the poll, Pat.
Wow, that's definitely a high number. If you might be concerned about having a mold problem, now might be a good time to look in those places that I mentioned earlier, your plumbing system, HVAC, fans, potential damp spots, to look and see if, maybe there's something there, something visible, something you might be able to smell that can point towards more concrete, reason to undergo pre-remediation and eventually mold remediation. Also, one other thing that I didn't mention, but that should absolutely be mentioned, is that any history of flooding in your building should also be a cause for concern. So if you have a history of flooding in your building, that's going to be a dead giveaway. So we'll keep on moving here. Okay, so now we're going to get into your specific mold danger level. So every building is going to have a different mold danger level. It's dependent on a lot of different factors, including who's there, what kinds of things take place in your building, that kind of stuff. So, like I said, there are several factors: presence of immunocompromised individuals, airflow, previous history of mold. Here we have a more inclusive list. So if you work with children, the elderly, sick people, if there might be people who have an HIV infection, something that compromises their immune system might not, make them able to combat an infection that might be mold related. That's definitely going to be cause for concern. Also, if your building has a history of mold or water damage, so a persistent history of mold is something that, is going to be very, very much a cause for concern, and it's going to be something that, you're going to have to keep an eye on, especially if there's, a flood in the basement. If you have carpeting that has gotten wet in the past and has stayed wet, hasn't been fully dried out, that's going to be a place where mold can take root. One thing that a lot of people think is that, oh, if I just stick a fan in this room for 2 days, 3 days, something like that, that'll get rid of all the moisture. But there's a lot of different factors at play, especially when you consider a disaster scenario like a flood. There's carpet padding that's in there that can cause mold growth, around the walls. If there is moisture in paint, paint is a place where a lot of mold can grow. Inside the walls, studs, insulation, that kind of stuff. So, a high mold danger level would be a result of a lot of a history of flooding, a history of persistent moisture in your building. Also, if the HVAC system or plumbing systems in your building are outdated, that's obviously going to be something that can contribute to a high mold danger level. There's going to be a high risk that there is mold in your building, or there's a potential for mold to develop quickly if it does get a chance to take root. You know, if there's a plumbing leak, if the HVAC system isn't doing its job properly, that kind of stuff. Like I said, large spills of liquids. Doesn't even have to be a flood scenario. You know, if somebody's walking through a break room, drops a glass of water and just kind of leaves it, that can be a spot where a significant amount of mold can grow very quickly, and you can have a much bigger problem than, you know, just having somebody dab it with a paper towel for 5 minutes and then move on. So in summary, we went over the common types of mold. You know, hopefully everybody was able to see the different kinds of mold, how all of these different kinds can help you formulate a plan to develop a mold remediation strategy. Potential sources of mold as well. So if you believe that you might have a mold problem, you might want to do a little bit more investigating, a little bit of seeing, smelling, touching, tasting, that kind of stuff, to see if there might be something there that is worth investigating further, maybe checking out remediation, etc. And then we went into figuring out your specific mold danger level. So different places have different mold danger levels. It's going to depend on a huge variety of factors: occupancy, history of the building, you know, state of the infrastructure, that kind of stuff. And now we're going to move on to a case study in a moment. So in relation to this case study, you know, mold is an issue that's hard to pin down. Understanding it and finding it is essential to remediation, and that's something that we think was very important in figuring out a remediation strategy for our next case study, and is something that everybody should keep in mind when dealing with any kind of mold issue or potential mold issue. So this case study took place a few years ago at a local college. The college had the carpets cleaned before an extended break. I think it was Thanksgiving break, and you know, the company that was contracted to perform the carpet cleaning didn't dry it out properly, so there was a few days, maybe 4 or 5 days, where mold was able to take root in this slightly damp carpet that hadn't been properly dried, and you know, it caused the white mold that you can see on the carpet here in these two pictures. Definitely an issue in a place like a college where there's going to be a huge variety of people coming through: elderly professors, younger students, maybe children of students, that kind of stuff. So definitely a high mold danger level at some place like a community college. So like I said, it was a small isolated mold incident at a local university. It was in a classroom. I believe it was in a basement classroom, which makes it a little bit trickier to dry out the area. So what was done, the first thing we did was we went in and we assessed the situation. We saw that, okay, clearly there's mold hyphae that are forming on the carpet, most likely releasing spores. We also performed some air sampling. So we took a sample outside to get a good background idea, see what we can expect in a normal indoor situation around here, around this area, at this time of year under these specific conditions. And then we obviously took 1 or 2 readings inside the room itself to determine that yes, these spots are indeed mold. They are releasing spores that could be potentially harmful. And one other thing that we did was we took air samples outside of the classroom itself to make sure that this mold issue was completely contained, not completely, if it was mostly contained within the room of concern, within this room that had mold spots on the carpet. We wanted to make sure that the mold issue wasn't a larger building-wide issue. And then to perform remediation, we needed a really quick, really aggressive remediation plan because, like I said earlier, there's a very high mold danger level at this specific spot. You know, there was a lot of different people going through this area, a lot of potential for someone to potentially get hurt by this kind of mold. So we went in, we took out the carpet, dried the area thoroughly right down to the very floor, all the walls in addition. You know, we wanted to make sure that there was no persistent moisture within the wall, in the paint, in the studs, in the insulation. Anywhere where there's moisture, you will find mold if you don't take care of that moisture very quickly, dry it out thoroughly, and then you can move on with your life. You don't have to worry about mold quite as much if there's proof that there's no persistent moisture. And then a week or so after we had taken the carpet out, the college had replaced it. We performed additional air sampling to ensure that all the mold had been taken care of. There was no moisture that we were missing that might still be causing harm, causing a foothold for mold. So this kind of comprehensive strategy is something that's absolutely crucial to, getting rid of a mold issue 100% and making sure that your building is clean and healthy and everybody within your building can go about their daily business. So with all this information, you now are able to develop an action plan. You're going to want to use your senses to inspect your workplace. So if you have a musty smell, if you get another indication that there might be a mold issue, if you see some brown streaking, some green streaking on the floor, something along those lines, that's going to be a sign that there's likely uncontrolled mold growth in your building, and that is going to be cause for concern. That's something that you should have checked out by a professional. You can also create your very own mold danger level to determine, how aggressively should I pursue any kind of mold remediation strategy whatsoever. If there are children in my building, if there are the elderly in my building, if I'm dealing with sick people, I'm going to have a very high mold danger level, and that's going to be something that can influence the rest of your decision into whether or not to remediate. How quickly does this need to be taken care of? How much danger am I possibly putting people in? How much danger might I be in? Those kinds of factors. When in doubt, seek professional assistance. I opened this webinar with there's a lot of misinformation out there about mold. There's a lot of gray areas associated with mold, and it's something that takes a trained eye with years of experience to fully remediate and make sure that your building is safe and clean. We also have a checklist on the blog, on the Triumvirate EH&S blog, that goes over the major potential sources of mold, where to look, what might be an indication of a potential mold problem. So that's a really comprehensive way to check out your building 360 degrees and make sure that there isn't some kind of mold issue that you should get checked out further. Or maybe if there is some kind of mold issue, then you might want to pursue a remediation strategy from there. So now we're going to open up to some questions. James, I believe you've been collecting questions.
Yeah, Pat. So we've got a few that have come in already. I want to first thank you for some great advice there on finding and rectifying mold contamination. As indicated in the poll, it is of concern. So we want to make sure your questions are answered, and encourage you, we've got some time here, to type in any questions you have for Pat. We'll do our best to answer them all. Any that we don't get to will be responded afterwards. So we will follow up. We won't completely ignore any questions. We may just have to do a little legwork on our end. So let's start off with one question that gets to an aspect you discussed. So what if we typically have elderly people in the building and we think that there is a mold problem? Of course, that presents an issue. What should we do before sampling?
So before sampling, especially if you're dealing with people who have a reduced immune system, if they can't fight infections immediately, one of the first things you want to do is make sure that everybody who has a compromised immune system, like the elderly, as was mentioned in the question, you want to move those people out of the affected area. And then once sampling occurs, you'll have a better idea of the landscape of how much of your building this problem is affecting, which areas are potentially dangerous, and which are safe to conduct business.
Great, thanks for that. I think that answers the question. Pat, what about stachybotrys and rusts and smuts? These are a few that people have been bringing up.
Okay, so those types of mold are definitely more rare than some of the ones that we've discussed. Typically not too much of an issue around here. However, the fact that they are rare, they are more dangerous than some of the other types of mold that we went over.
Got it.
There.
Yeah, that's good to know. And I guess kind of building on that, someone is kind of inquiring about black mold, which is something we hear about pretty often on the news. What does this term mean exactly, and how does that fit into this whole scenario you've presented?
So black mold, in quotation marks, black mold, that's not really a scientific term that professionals use. We like to break it down more into the specific groups in that characterization table that I went over earlier. Black mold is a term that's typically used by the media to kind of, instill the severity of more harmful types of mold, like Stachybotrys. That's one that is typically used interchangeably with black mold. When news outlets are referring to black mold, they're typically referring to Stachybotrys. And rust and smuts are also, you know, um, subsets of Ascomycota, and those go along with Stachybotrys in a way.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that one. So when we talk about remediation, or actually let's start with sampling. The question is, what kind of scenarios would mold sampling be recommended?
Mold sampling, it really gives you a good basis for, formulating a bigger remediation plan. So you really can't, begin in earnest until you found out exactly what the spore counts are. We use spores per cubic meter to determine what types of mold are present where. Um, if you have, if one of your five senses is indicating a potential mold issue, sampling is a good way to, get a bearing, get a firm idea of, okay, what kinds of mold are present in my building, in what quantities, and then from there you can move on to a more comprehensive, better specified remediation strategy.
Can you give an example on what quantity is sort of an alarming level as far as spore counts? What should
It's about 1,000 spores per cubic meter is typically the number that we associate with an elevated spore count that could be potentially harmful.
Got it. That's a good benchmark. Now moving into a remediation question, what other methods are there to remediate mold other than pulling up drywall, carpeting, ceiling tile? Is there anything else that can be done, or does it all have to come out?
So those types of remediation are recommended for larger mold issues. Very extensive drying, very thorough drying is also a possibility. But if something is overgrown with mold, so a lot of the times if we, have to open up a wall, or if a wall is opened up as part of a construction project and it's seen that there is extensive mold within that space, then that's going to be, we're typically going to have to, clear that out, replace it, and then to prevent the issue further, we can paint over with a fungicidal paint treatment that will then inhibit mold in that area for the future.
Great. And when we think about prevention, someone brought up a good point. Do dehumidifiers work for concrete basements to prevent or remediate isolated areas that previously were wet?
A dehumidifier alone is probably not going to do it entirely. It's just not direct enough. It's not a direct enough way to combat a moisture problem, as opposed to, ideally getting rid of the persistently moist medium, whether that be a carpet or a piece of drywall or something like that. More direct airflow, something like a fan, something like a high power fan. Or also, if we're talking about a concrete basement, one way that we prefer to take care of moisture issues in concrete is using a HEPA vacuum that can go in and suck all the moisture out of concrete, wood, porous surfaces like that.
Great. And you talked about mold in paint, and just sort of a clarifying question here. When you referred to that, did you mean in the paint, or is this between the paint in the wall surface?
This is actually within the paint itself. So acrylic paints can be a place in and of themselves for mold to grow. That can be a good medium. I think on the mold characterization table it lists paint as a common host medium for Cladosporium, in addition to plant matter and textiles, so like cloths. So yes, it would be the paint itself that can pose an issue.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that one. And we're gonna back up a sec to sampling again. Do you recommend performing swipe tests or just air sampling? And what is your opinion of the ERMI testing?
Well, typically we perform air sampling first and foremost. That's a good way to get a idea of what a typical person would be breathing in, and obviously causing health concerns. If we see something that might be indicative of mold growth, we're going to take a tape lift sample and get that analyzed at the lab. Wipe sampling isn't employed too often by us, but if there's some place where it might not be feasible to do a tape sample, then we would do a wipe sample.
Okay, thanks, Pat. And I'm reading this next question here, and we're getting back to the Aspergillus and Penicillium mold
Okay.
that you discussed. So when we talk about those levels specifically, it's mentioned that those typically are higher indoors than outdoors. So what level there should we consider this a problem? Is it the same metric that you discussed before?
Finding those types of mold, it's harder to nail down a specific number. We usually don't go by numbers in general other than that 1,000 indoor count. Those types of mold we're going to evaluate based on a more holistic strategy. So if those molds are common outdoors around the area, then it's not going to be too much of a concern if we find similar levels within the building. It's more of a proportional type analysis than a specific, if we see 250 spores per cubic meter of Aspergillus, then we're going to, go in and start ripping up carpet. It's definitely more of a nuanced, qualitative analysis.
Sure. Okay. Thanks for that. And I think the same goes for a couple other of those types. So if anyone has specific questions on metrics, I think we do need to understand your environment a little bit better to kind of help you and determine whether the levels that you're experiencing are too high. So we can talk offline if there's a specific case you want to discuss. The next question gets at a small mold problem. So what's the recommended product or solution to remediate a small amount of mold in an area?
A small amount of mold can typically be remediated by fairly non-invasive means. Simply, drying out and then subsequent sampling to ensure that mold issue has been taken care of. Like I said, use of HEPA vacuums, use of those kinds of equipment can be helpful to remediate smaller problems. In addition, we also use some fungicidal chemical treatments that can also be used to directly combat the issue.
Got it. Good suggestions. Yeah, in that case, we don't need to rip the whole room up, I assume.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
So the next question is, how do you respond to people who have introduced the medium into their office and are sure from this that they have mold? Example, using a mold test kit.
So actually, just this past summer, I dealt with an issue in Connecticut where somebody had introduced a mold test kit, a commercial mold test kit, into their building and seen uncontrolled mold growth within that space. And when it comes to the commercial kits, honestly, the biggest issue arising from those is the spores that are produced by the mold structures that form within the test kit itself. So in a way, it's a little bit counterproductive to try and grow mold within your own building to determine that you have mold. Mold spores are everywhere. They're perfectly normal in the air, and they won't affect the overwhelming majority of people. But if you give it an ideal medium, then it will grow. And if you have a known ideal medium within your building that is producing mold growth, mold spores, that in and of itself is going to be a health issue. So if somebody were to grow mold intentionally in their own space, I would recommend that they get rid of that mold and monitor their moisture levels in their building very carefully to make sure that those spores that formed from the test kit can't get into places in their building where they can then cause a mold problem that is intrinsic to the building itself.
Great, thanks for illustrating that with an example too. That was pretty clear. The next question, I think I know the answer to this one. It's probably an example of what not to do. But is painting over mold, some sort of surface level treatment like that, an acceptable method to control mold?
Just painting over it probably isn't going to get the job done. It actually definitely won't get the job done if you're just painting over it, because then there's still, there's still mold that is present there. And, if you paint over a mold issue, you haven't remediated the mold issue. So there's nothing that has gone and prevented the issue in the future. So you can paint over a spot of mold, but you haven't fixed the issue that caused the mold to be there. So, you definitely want something more comprehensive than simply painting over a mold spot on your wall, on your floor, on your ceiling, something like that.
Sure, just to be on the safe side, of course.
Mm-hmm.
The next question is, we've got time for a couple more here, so we'll start to wrap things up shortly. Is there a way to quantify typical spore counts outside of buildings, and how can this vary?
So spore counts outside of buildings are almost always, hopefully, going to be higher than indoors, and there's a way to quantify them. We quantify them as part of our air sampling scheme, and then we use that to evaluate indoor counts. But comparing spore counts outside, especially in different places or at different times of the year, is definitely not something that's going to be productive, because, like I said, these, the amount of spores in the air is going to vary hugely based on location and time of year. So there's not really a good way to kind of, I guess if you're trying to get an outdoor remediation strategy, that's not really something that's feasible considering the high normal amount of mold that's found in outdoor air, mold spores.
Got it, thanks. That can be a trickier situation, but good advice there too. Let's take a couple more. So someone here works in a facility that houses animals, which contains bedding. What can I do to minimize the possibility of a mold problem there?
So I work in an animal holding facility too, and this is a question that we get that, I've been faced with by coworkers a lot. And the best advice I can give is to change the bedding often, and to ensure that this bedding doesn't get wet for a prolonged period of time. We had an issue where we started to see some kind of fuzz growing in an animal cage in our very own lab, which was due to the water bottle that was, serving the mouse that was in the cage was dripping into the bedding, causing, this really, really good medium for mold to grow. There's plant matter, there's moisture, it was dark a lot of the time. So, change the animal bedding often and make sure that water can't get into the bedding itself. Our solution was just to put a petri dish underneath the water bottle to catch all the water that was falling out, just a little empty petri dish.
Right, that's a great solution. So hopefully that helps if there is a problem that this person is facing. You discussed flooding as an event that can lead to mold. How soon after a flood event does mold take root, and when can one say that they are out of the woods? Is that possible?
So mold typically takes about 24 to 48 hours to manifest itself. That's a good benchmark where, you can see if mold has taken root, typically within 48 hours. You definitely want to keep a particular eye on your situation for the next week or so. I think that 1 week without any signs of uncontrolled mold growth after a flooding issue has been completely taken care of. That's typically a good benchmark, is 1 week. But like I said, any history of flooding in a building, any place where there's a lot of moisture that's consistently within a building, That's always going to be at the top of your list when it comes to looking for potential places where mold might be growing.
All right, good. Thanks, Pat. And I think we'll finish off here with one last question, and then we'll go on to our remaining slides. Who would you recommend be responsible for these assessments? Who should sort of take leadership here? And does it make sense to designate someone to perform kind of routine assessments just to stay on top of the issue?
Mm-hmm. That's kind of a tricky one because, obviously a high level of expertise is recommended for anyone who's going to be dealing with these issues regularly and who's going to be an authority on these issues. Um, but, routine air sampling isn't going to be recommended. It's usually more of a team effort than having one specific person go around and, sniff in the basement for 2 minutes and, look at the grates for 5 minutes. It's something that is usually discovered more based on multiple people that can keep an eye on everything, make sure that there's no black spots that are developing, any of the signs that I mentioned earlier. But yeah, regular intensive testing is typically not recommended because it might not be, you might, it might not be necessarily productive to devote that much time and effort, especially if there's nothing that's dynamic in your building. If you're just going day to day, then, weekly mold assessments probably aren't going to yield much. But if, you discover a problem like a plumbing leak, then you should be extra vigilant in your evaluation of whether or not there might be uncontrolled mold growth in your building.
Right, so lots of transparency, just working with your team, speaking up, and being conscious of the issue. That's good advice. So I lied. Let's take one more. We've got another couple of minutes.
Sure.
So this question is, if the spore counts vary outside, will they not vary inside depending on the HVAC, the HVAC filtration?
They will vary inside, and that will give you that'll give you an idea of where to start in your mold remediation scheme. So, like I said during that case study, if there's one room that one room had a very high spore count, but then the hallway and then the room next door had very low spore counts, then we were able to determine that that room was, there was mold that was being produced, mold spores being produced within that room that weren't necessarily going elsewhere. So that's why it takes more of a holistic strategy to examine the entire kind of mold landscape of your building to determine the best practices.
Right, and related to that, finally, is testing for that outdoor concentration on the other side of the walls. Can that be useful when assessing a mold contamination indoors? Is that recommended?
Yes, absolutely. That's what we use. That's the proportion that we use to determine whether or not there is uncontrolled mold growth, is whether or not there is a higher spore count or there are more types of mold present within the building than outside the building. That's the dead giveaway. That's the final straw when you're trying to decide whether or not remediation is a good idea for your building, is whether or not the types of mold found in the background, found outside, are also present indoors, or if there's more types of mold or higher concentrations of mold within your building than are outdoors.
Great. Well, thank you, Pat. I think we'll wrap it up there. An excellent Q&A session. So I want to thank everyone for your questions. I know there may have been one or two specific ones we didn't get to, so we will follow up with you in the next couple of days. Thanks for those. And I think we'll move on to that last slide there just to reinforce what the follow-up is like. And we're going to send you the materials here. You're going to get the presentation tomorrow. We'll also send you a short survey, so please let us know what you thought. Good and bad if we're looking for recommendations, and we want to continuously improve these webinars as we're bringing them to you on a weekly basis. And we'll also have a special offer for you as you embark on this mold assessment journey to figure out how concerned you should be with your own situation. So Pat, thank you again for your advice, for the presentation. Do you have anything else to add before we close up here?
No, I think I covered just about everything in that Q&A session. That was a really good Q&A session. Thank you everyone for attending, and stay mold free, I guess.
Thanks. All right, well, that concludes the webinar. Please look out for that email tomorrow, and we hope to see you on a future webinar sometime soon. Take care. Have a good one.